Bewitched wasn't supposed to end like this. For 8 years, millions of viewers watched Samantha Stevens turn ordinary problems into magical disasters with nothing more than a twitch of her nose. She could stop time, move objects, change people, and somehow make even the strangest situation feel like home. But when the final episode aired in 1972, there was no huge goodbye, no emotional farewell, no dramatic ending, and no warning that viewers were watching the last moments of one of television's most beloved sitcoms. Instead, there was one ordinary scene that quietly closed the door on Bewitched forever. And the strangest part? That scene wasn't even new. It closely echoed an earlier episode. So why did the show end this way? Was there really an infamous moment that killed the series? Or was something much bigger happening behind the scenes? Because by the time Samantha cast her final spell, the magic had already been disappearing for years. And the story behind that ending is far more complicated than most fans realize. The show that changed television. When Bewitched premiered on September 17, 1964, the idea sounded almost ridiculous. A beautiful witch marries an ordinary man and promises to live a normal suburban life. The problem? She isn't exactly normal. Samantha Stevens had magical powers, while her husband Darren wanted nothing to do with them. That simple conflict became one of television's most successful formulas. Samantha wanted peace. Darren wanted normality. And Endora, Samantha's powerful mother, wanted to make Darren's life as difficult as possible. Every week, the same impossible combination somehow worked. There would be a misunderstanding. Someone would use magic. Darren would panic. Samantha would try to fix everything. And eventually, the family would find its way back to normal. But underneath the comedy was something much deeper. Samantha was constantly being asked to hide part of herself. Her magical abilities were powerful, but Darren wanted her to behave like an ordinary housewife. For audiences in the 1960s, that made the show more than fantasy. It reflected real questions about marriage, identity, independence, and the pressure to fit into society's expectations. And Elizabeth Montgomery made Samantha almost impossible not to love. She was elegant without being cold, powerful without being cruel. And even when everything around her collapsed, Samantha usually remained calm. That became the heart of Bewitched. But the heart of the show wasn't the only thing holding it together. There was another secret. The people playing these characters were carrying problems of their own. And eventually, those problems began appearing behind the magic. Bewitched becomes a television phenomenon. The first few seasons were enormous. Audiences couldn't get enough of Samantha's nose twitch. The opening animation became instantly recognizable. The suburban Stevens home became one of television's most familiar settings. And Bewitched quickly became one of ABC's biggest successes. At its peak, the show was regularly among America's most watched programs. For ABC, it was more than a hit sitcom. It helped establish the network as a serious competitor during an era dominated by CBS and NBC. But success created pressure. The cast had to keep producing episode after episode. The same characters had to remain funny. The same magical tricks had to keep feeling fresh. And behind the scenes, the demands of television were taking their toll. The first major crack came with the man playing Darren Stevens, Dick York. To millions of viewers, York was simply Samantha's frustrated husband. But the truth was much more painful. The tragedy behind Darren Stevens. Dick York's career had already been impressive before Bewitched. He had worked in radio, theater, television, and film. But in the late 1950s, his life changed during the production of the movie They Came to Cordura. While filming, York suffered a serious back injury. At first, he tried to keep working. That decision would follow him for the rest of his life. The pain became chronic. And when he was cast as Darren Stevens, he was already struggling physically. As Bewitched became a massive hit, York's condition became worse. He sometimes needed to lie down between takes. The production reportedly made adjustments to help him manage his pain. But eventually, medication became part of his daily life. And the line between controlling the pain and depending on medication became increasingly difficult to escape. Then, during the show's 5th season, York collapsed on set. That was the breaking point. He could no longer continue. Dick York left Bewitched. And suddenly, one of the show's most important characters had a completely different face. Dick Sargent took over as Darren. There was no elaborate explanation, no magical transformation, no emotional goodbye. To viewers, Darren simply looked different. Some accepted the change. Others never did. And although Sargent was a talented actor, the chemistry had changed. Something familiar was gone. The show continued, but the first spell had already been broken. The cast was changing. Dick York wasn't the only loss. Alice Pierce, who played the unforgettable nosy neighbor Gladys Kravitz, was also facing a devastating personal battle. Pierce had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer before joining Bewitched. Yet she continued working. Her character became one of the show's funniest sources of chaos. Gladys was always convinced that something supernatural was happening next door, and somehow she was usually right. But audiences didn't know what Pierce was fighting in real life. She died in 1966. Her performance was later honored with a posthumous Emmy Award. Sandra Gould eventually took over the role of Gladys. Again, the show continued. Again, viewers adjusted. But every replacement changed the feeling of the series. Bewitched was still Bewitched, just not exactly the same Bewitched. And then came another problem. The show's own creative foundation was beginning to crack. When the magic started fading, Elizabeth Montgomery wasn't just the star. She was deeply connected to the show's production. Her husband, William Asher, was the producer and director who helped shape Bewitched from the beginning. Their professional partnership had been extremely important to the series, but their marriage eventually began falling apart. And that created a difficult situation. The people responsible for maintaining the show's magic were dealing with personal problems behind the cameras. By the final seasons, the atmosphere surrounding the production was very different from the early years. The series was still popular. The characters were still recognizable. The magical effects still worked. But the excitement wasn't the same. Storylines began revisiting familiar ideas. The formula that had once felt brilliant could now feel predictable. And television itself was changing. The audience that had fallen in love with Bewitched in the 1960s was moving into a different era. New shows were appearing. New styles of comedy were becoming popular. And Bewitched was entering its 8th season. Then came the moment fans would later remember as the show's final scene. The infamous final episode. The final episode of Bewitched was titled, "The Truth. Nothing but the Truth. So help me, Sam." It aired on March 12, 1972. And if you expected a dramatic series finale, you would have been disappointed. There was no giant goodbye. No grand magical battle. No emotional montage showing Samantha's life over 8 seasons. Instead, the story returned to something Bewitched had done many times before. Endora gives Darren a magical object that causes him to tell the truth. Suddenly, Darren can't control what comes out of his mouth. His honesty creates problems. His work becomes complicated. His relationships become awkward. And Samantha is once again forced to clean up the magical mess. It sounds like a normal Bewitched episode. And that's exactly the point. The finale didn't feel like a finale. It felt like another Thursday night. Another magical problem. Another argument. Another episode where Samantha and Darren eventually find their way back to each other. But this time, there was no next episode. When the credits rolled, that was it. Bewitched was finished. And millions of viewers didn't even realize they had just watched the end. So what was the infamous scene? This is where the story becomes interesting. The title of the final episode suggests something important. But there wasn't one forbidden or scandalous scene that literally forced Bewitched off television. The reality was much quieter. The show ended because its run had reached its natural conclusion. Ratings had declined from their earlier highs. The production had gone through major cast changes. Elizabeth Montgomery's enthusiasm for continuing was fading. And the creative team had already produced hundreds of episodes. The final episode itself was also remarkably familiar. It resembled an earlier storyline from the series. And that may be why some fans remember the ending as disappointing. After 8 years of magic, the audience expected something extraordinary. Instead, they received another Bewitched story. There was no big explanation, no final statement, no moment telling viewers, "This is goodbye." The show simply stopped, and that ordinary ending became part of its legend. Because sometimes the strangest endings are the ones that don't feel like endings at all. Why didn't they give Samantha a proper goodbye? There was a reason. Television finales weren't always treated the way they are today. Modern audiences expect a series finale to wrap everything up. Characters receive closure. Stories are completed. The audience is reminded that the journey is ending. But in the early 1970s, many television shows simply aired their final scheduled episode. There didn't have to be a giant celebration. There didn't have to be a farewell special. And because Bewitched had already become a huge syndication success, the characters weren't really disappearing. They were about to live forever in reruns. Every time a station replayed an old episode, Samantha was back. Darren was back. And Dora was back. The magic continued. Only the production had ended. And perhaps that was fitting, because Bewitched had always been about making ordinary life feel magical. This final episode did exactly that. Treated the ending like another ordinary day. But there was one more problem. The biggest issue wasn't one scene. It was exhaustion. Imagine producing a television series for 8 seasons. Hundreds of episodes. Long shooting schedules. Repeated sets. Repeated characters. Constant pressure. And a star whose personal life was changing. By the final years, the show had lost some of the energy that made its early seasons special. The original Darren was gone. The original Gladys was gone. The marriage between Elizabeth Montgomery and William Asher was ending. And the television landscape was changing. The magic wasn't destroyed overnight. It disappeared piece by piece. One actor left. Another replaced them. One relationship changed. One storyline was repeated. One season felt slightly less exciting than the previous one. Until eventually, everyone realized the same thing.